It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10, live from Jerusalem. Our top story. The first hostages freed by Hamas, mother and daughter, both American citizens. But up to 200 others are still being held.
What I shared with the families, as the President did as well, is that the entire United States government will work every minute of every day to secure their release, to bring their loved ones home.
In Gaza, more civilians killed where they thought they'd be safe while sheltering at a church. And on the West Bank, flaming anger as protesters are targeted by Israeli snipers firing live rounds.
Also coming up in the programme, a storm Babet claims 3 lives as rivers burst their banks, and another red warning is issued in Scotland. And in England, a plane skids across the runway as heavy rain causes severe disruption. Plus, Sir Keir Starmer's prediction he'll be an heir to Blair after his party's double by-election win. And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages in our press preview from 10:30 right through to midnight.
Hello, good evening. They are only 2 among 200. But tonight, a mother and daughter, both American citizens, are safely in Israel after being released by Hamas militants. Judith and Natalie Raanan were held for almost 2 weeks before they were freed for humanitarian reasons. The US President Joe Biden said he was overjoyed and that negotiations are still underway for more Americans to be freed. In a moment, we'll witness the grief of a father after a church was destroyed, and we report from the West Bank where Palestinian protesters are being shot with live rounds. But first, this report from our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes.
A moment of mercy amid the misery as 2 hostages are released by Hamas. Natalie and her mother Judith, both Americans, were handed over to the Red Cross. Hamas said they'd been freed for humanitarian reasons, with Qatar helping to mediate. No word yet, though, on the fate of around 200 other captives, mainly Israelis, but also foreigners.
It's impossible to adequately put into words the agony they're feeling of not knowing the fate of their loved ones. Worrying relentlessly about them, for their safety, for their security, for their well-being. No family anywhere should have to experience this torture.
The family of the freed Americans had been praying for their release back in the United States.
My sister and niece arrived to Israel to celebrate my mom's 85th birthday and spend the Jewish holidays with us.
The teenager and her mother had been visiting the Nahal Oz kibbutz, close to the Gaza border, when they'd been kidnapped by Hamas during a surprise attack on the 7th of October. Their sudden release, raising hope the remaining hostages may also soon be freed, even as Israel prepares for an anticipated ground invasion of Gaza. The Israeli Defense Minister earlier spelling out a 3-stage plan to eradicate Hamas.
There will be 3 main stages. First, we will destroy the Hamas organisation, eliminate the military and governmental infrastructure. That's the first thing. It's not going to be easy. There will be a toll. We will need the support of everybody in the army on this.
It's a war that's also being fought from the sea. Israel's Navy allowed us to film on a patrol vessel off the Israeli coastline close to Gaza. Smooth sailing for now. But Hamas used these waters as part of their assault on Israel 2 weeks ago. Footage shared by the military shows fast boats trying to storm the shore, coming under Israeli fire.
The teams and the Navy forces out at sea identified and eliminated many of these horrible terrorists. And we will keep doing our assignment of protecting this area.
And since the 7th of October, have there been any other attempts by Hamas to attack Israel from the sea?
Yes, there's been attempts, but...
What sort of things have happened?
There's many threats from the sea. Let's keep it at that.
They're threats that will likely only grow. But so too for the families of the many remaining hostages in Gaza. Each missing person marked by an empty chair at this vigil in Tel Aviv. Pressure surely mounting on Israel to secure the release of their civilians before sending in their soldiers. Deborah Haynes, Sky News, Southern Israel.
And we'll speak to our US correspondent Mark Stone in a moment. But first to Deborah in southern Israel. So, Deborah, these two people handed to Israeli military by the Red Cross. This is a significant development tonight, isn't it? How does it change things?
Yes, and we've seen the first image, I think, of the two released hostages meeting with the Israel Defense Forces in what was this very surprise, welcome move after 2 weeks of being held captive. And of course, the focus shifts to the remaining hostages. Now we've seen it is possible for mediators to secure the release of two. What then for the remainders? And surely, as long as there are hostages being held in Gaza, it makes it incredibly difficult for the Israeli military to move on to the next stage of their war with this expected ground invasion. So, although we don't have word about whether or not there has been a delay, clearly the fact that it's possible to negotiate the release of hostages means that perhaps more time will be given for more hostages to be freed. But tonight we don't know that. We just know that for two families at least, there's a very, very welcome homecoming happening very soon.
And Mark, the US president, releasing a statement saying that he was overjoyed and stressing that they are working tirelessly for the release of others.
Yes, after a very, very long week for so many different governments around the world as they try to contain this crisis, this is a little bit of very good news. It is clear, though, that it is part of such a sensitive series of negotiations. I've just come from a briefing at the Israeli embassy here in Washington, D.C., an off-the-record briefing, allowing officials to speak more frankly. But even when we asked them off the record for any details on this hostage situation and how the negotiations were going, they were not able to tell us anything at all. It is clear, though, that the Qataris are absolutely key. A statement tonight from the Qatari government makes clear that they will continue dialogue with both the Israelis and Hamas, and that they hope these efforts will lead to more hostages being released in the coming days. And in essence, they want to de-escalate the current crisis and to restore peace. I think there is another very important aspect to what we have seen unfold over the course of the day. That still photograph shows you that physically these two hostages are in good health. We didn't, up until the point at which that photograph had been released, we didn't know that. Antony Blinken did not give any details on what their physical health was. The fact that they're physically healthy will allow, perhaps, if their mental health is up to it, it will allow officials, both Israeli officials and American officials, to debrief them, to get potentially very, very important intelligence from them, where they were being held, who was holding them, did they recognize any of the, well, they may well show them images of Hamas officials, did they recognize any of the people, any intelligence that they can gain from these two people, from these two former hostages, to allow the authorities in Israel and perhaps with American assistance to rescue some of the other hostages. This is a very fast-moving story tonight, but clearly a very good news one as well. Mark Stone and Deborah Haynes, thank you both.
Well, if ever there was a symbol of the stalled diplomacy in this war, it was the image of the UN Secretary-General standing at the Rafah border crossing with the gates closed behind him. Antonio Guterres made an impassioned plea for the 20 trucks which have been waiting for days to be allowed to deliver their aid to be allowed through. And even then, Israel's bombardment continues. Several people killed as they sheltered at a church. This report from our international correspondent John Sparks contains images of the aftermath of an airstrike.
In the words of the United Nations, the Gaza Strip has now become a hellhole. Yet the only way to send in humanitarian aid is shut. 100 trucks packed with desperately needed supplies waiting at the Rafah crossing in Egypt, where they've been stuck for days. And it was here that the UN Secretary-General decided to ditch the diplomacy from a podium erected in front of the gate.
Behind these walls, we have 2 million people that is suffering enormously, that has no water, no food, no medicine, no fuel.
Moderation replaced with exasperation here as the Egyptians and Israelis disagree on the number and content of aid shipments.
These trucks are not just trucks. They are a lifeline. They are the difference between life and death for so many people in Gaza.
International aid agencies have become increasingly alarmed and their language increasingly strident. UN experts calling Israel's siege and bombardment unspeakably cruel. In Gaza City, the blast from an Israeli airstrike destroyed the hall and scout center at an Orthodox church. The Christian community had been using them as shelters. Put your hand under Salim, said one, as parishioners tried to extract their friends and loved ones from the rubble. This man had lost his life. God has deserted us, said some. Some, like this father of 3. Look at this child. Do you think he deserved to die? Said Ara Mansouri. He showed our team pictures of his children, Majdi, Julie and Swella. All 3 died in the blast.
This is a crime. It's a crime against humanity. This F-16 aeroplane threw these things knowing there were people down there. They did it with hatred. No one in Gaza feels safe, but being in the church gave us the feeling that we were close to God.
Israel says it doesn't target civilians as it seeks to destroy Hamas. But that means little to the congregation of St. Porphyrius, now living their own kind of hell. John Sparks, Sky News.
2 teenagers have been killed in clashes in the West Bank, bringing the total number killed in the Palestinian territory since the start of the conflict to 83. Palestinian youths and the Israeli military have been clashing daily, with many continuing to protest despite the threat of snipers. Our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, was on the streets in Ramallah after Friday prayers. His report shows the moment that a protester is shot.
Another day of protests on the West Bank, the stone-throwing youths and the defence forces squaring up for an exchange of rocks and bullets. They use the burnt-out hulk of a truck for cover and to get a better angle. As soon as they go forward, a sniper shoots. He's helped back and an ambulance screeches in to pick him up. They know the score. This is completely normal here. Still at the very front, a teenager takes another tyre to make more covering smoke. He skips as he crosses back, trying to outwit the snipers. But they have another target. This man had come from a different angle, but didn't get very far. The ambulance crews move in. The Israeli Defense Forces are making it absolutely clear to everyone that they mean business. I stopped counting at 9 people shot. Across the road, people take cover in a petrol station, but another round is fired.
2 ambulances have rushed forward to get the stone throwers. They shot them just a few metres from where we're standing. Ambulances come, it's a tried and trusted method. What's incredible is that they know this is going to happen. The stone throwers know they're going to be shot. The snipers know they're going to be shooting them, and it goes on and on and on. And they'll be whisked away now to hospital. And it'll go on. It's been going on all day.
The streets of Ramallah echo to the chants of people protesting against the actions of Israel, but also against the countries who have given their support. The United States and Britain are at the top of the list. The city centre came to a standstill, men, women and children joining the procession as it made its way through the streets.
Our enemy is not just Israel. Our enemy is the United States government, not people. We are appreciating every single voice that came out, especially from Jewish Voice for Peace and all these Jews that are standing up saying, don't do this massacres and decide on our names. This is our allies. This is the people that we are allies with. Not with Biden and his racist government there, not with Sunak also that he came, all of them came to support the genocide in Gaza. This is a shame. They should be ashamed of themselves.
All believe Israeli soldiers will move into Gaza. All acknowledge it will lead to more violence, both here on the West Bank and further afield.
I've lived all my life under occupation. Now I'm fearful for my children, for my co-workers. I mean, this government has all the Palestinians, 5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza under its complete control. We are, civilians, and they have the best weapons in the world to do whatever they want.
So the cycle of protest and violence continues. The flaming anger of Palestinians and the Arab world is burning brighter by the day. Any hope of a solution seems a completely futile wish. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News in Ramallah on the West Bank.
Well, we will have full coverage of all the developments in the war between Israel and Hamas in a special programme from Israel with me and Mark Austin. That's tomorrow at 1 p.m. here on Sky News. Now let's head back to Gillian for the rest of the day's news.
Anna, thank you. 3 people have now died as Storm Babet heads towards northern England. Hundreds of families have been told to evacuate their homes. And in the Scottish town of Brechin, emergency services fear the river will burst its banks within the next few hours. The Met Office has extended its red weather warning there into the weekend. Several areas have seen over a month's rainfall in the past 36 hours. The highest total was recorded in Waterside, Perth. More than 170 millimetres of rain has fallen so far. We begin tonight in one of the worst affected areas, the village of Brechin, from where Katerina Vitozzi sent this report.
Brechin's river burst its banks in the dark, early hours. The flood defence here, no match for the unprecedented volume of rain. The result, a day no one in Brechin will forget. A moment officials call a disaster. The water surge was fast and violent. It flooded homes in minutes, cutting power, marooning those who hadn't wanted to leave. Boat rescues have gone on for hours today in the wet and cold, saving families, the very young, the incredibly vulnerable.
Are you guys okay?
Yeah. Scott and his mother didn't believe it would be this bad. They thought they could cope.
There were warnings, weren't there, consistently?
Yeah, but we didn't think it would come to much because it never came to much the last time.
What's it like in your house now?
Well,
down the stairs is completely flooded.
So, down the stairs is completely flooded?
Everything's floated about.
Oh my goodness, what's... I didn't even see you've got a rabbit down here.
We just got him. I've had to leave the body because the cage is far too big. We'll come back tomorrow hopefully and get that in a car.
I'm so sorry, Scott. What a night you've had.
I know.
There is just still so much water here, and this is now, what, 12 hours since the river in this town burst its banks. Everywhere you look, it's submerged vehicles. You can see how high the water level got to when it peaked, able to get into homes through the windows. And when you see that, you think, really, what are a couple of sandbags by a front door going to save? They certainly weren't able to save Christine and Davy's flat.
Kitchen's quite bad, very bad I would say, and our bathroom's bad. I mean, it's just hard to believe, you know.
Christine, who's partially sighted, left yesterday afternoon when the evacuation order came in. The couple returned this morning to this. I bet you can't believe this has happened.
No, and you think it's not going to happen to us, you know. And I know it sounds selfish, but you do believe that. And times like this, reality is a way of saying, you know something, I told you. You know what I mean? Doesn't make it any easier.
All saving grace, I've got my photos. Carpets could be replaced, furniture could be replaced, but it's just the memories as well. With the grandchildren and that.
I know. It's just devastating.
Authorities say that by Sunday, 2 months' worth of rain will have fallen in days, that some rivers will likely overflow again. But there are still some who refuse to leave their homes, amidst the most severe of warnings that their lives could be at risk. Katerina Vitozzi, Sky News in Brecon.
A red weather warning is in place for parts of Scotland, and in England a man has died after being swept away by floodwaters in Shropshire. Homes have been flooded and motorways and railway lines submerged, with students and teachers still trapped in some schools in Suffolk. Lisa Dowd reports.
The ferocity of this storm was felt right across the UK. 3 people have already died, and the threat to life warnings keep coming. There has been unprecedented rainfall in places, and there's more to come. At Leeds Bradford Airport, hundreds of passengers were left stranded when their plane skidded off the runway.
My wife that sat next to me turned to me and said, I think you better brace yourself because this is not going to stop. The whole of the left-hand side that we were sat on, the wing was covered in mud and there was mud all over the place.
Elsewhere, the surges of floodwater caught so many out.
Happened in a split second. As soon as the water started coming in, it was like that, and then all of a sudden, I'm all through up the sofa now.
The River Erewash in Derbyshire is just one of dozens of overwhelmed waterways. Peter couldn't believe how quickly his home was underwater.
This is what I've been doing all morning, but fighting a losing battle because it's coming up to the sewer. There is sewage water in this, obviously.
Just over the border in Nottinghamshire, it was the same picture.
The drains just can't cope, so it's come back through the drains and through the air vents and the walls and the doors. So, awful, awful.
How are you feeling?
I could cry, but I'm not going to, because now the clean-up process starts.
The storm caused problems up and down the country. Schools shut early, and the emergency services asked people not to travel unless absolutely necessary. In so many parts of the country, there was just no way through. Train services had to be cancelled, and power was disrupted to many homes.
As we head into the weekend, we will see it become less persistent and less heavy in terms of rainfall, but there will still be some sporadic periods of rainfall, which will continue to see river levels remain high.
Hundreds of flood warnings remain in place. The authorities say that rivers will continue to swell over the coming days. Lisa Dowd, Sky News, Derbyshire.
Let's go live now to our correspondent Shingi Marariki, who's in Brecon for us. And Shingi, more rain expected where you are, and across England, some schools and students still being affected.
Yeah, that's right, Gillian. So where we are, we're expecting the second red weather warning in 2 days. And just to give you a sense of context, up until yesterday, there hadn't been a red weather warning for rain since 2020. And what that means is that disruption you've seen in both of those reports before me, as well as threat to life, which is feeling very real and palpable tonight off the back of the deaths of 3 people, 2 in Scotland, 1 in England. And this building behind me is a relief centre where we've seen a steady stream of people bringing essentials, clean clothes and other things to help people who have been displaced by the flooding here. And as you mentioned, it is a nationwide issue now, with flooding in Suffolk, for example, meaning that students and pupils are having to stay in their schools tonight. And one of the things that really struck me, having spent time here today, is the impact that this is having and the damage caused by the flood defences being breached, which happened at 4 a.m. this morning. But the people who had decided to hunker down and stay in their homes were essentially washed away in some cases, with some parts of the town only accessible by boats. Those people are having to pack up their lives, having to pack up their belongings and look for safety. And over the course of the next 24 hours, we can see similar scenes across the country.
They are the 2 by-election wins which could help pave the path to power for an increasingly confident Labour Party. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak may have pitched himself as a candidate for change, but voters in 2 different constituencies today appeared to be unconvinced by his message. In Tamworth, in 2019, Conservatives received 30,542 votes, equating to a 66.3% share of the vote. Fast forward to last night, and Labour won the seat with 11,719 votes. That's a swing of 23.9%. And in Nadine Dorries' former seat of Mid-Bedfordshire in 2019, the Conservatives earned 38,692 votes, 59.7% of the total vote. But Labour overturned that majority too, earning 13,872 votes, making another huge gain with a swing of 20.5%. It's those results that led one former cabinet minister to describe the run-up to the next election as the dying days of a corrosive party. Sky's political editor, Beth Rigby, reports.
And I do hereby declare that Sarah Sienna Edwards is duly elected.
Not one political earthquake, but 2. Labour storming Tory strongholds in these record-breaking by-elections. Keir Starmer out early to Mid-Beds, where Labour overturned a near 25,000 Tory majority.
We go forward, thank you so much, an incredible result.
An incredible result. They can barely believe the win. Mid-Beds has been Tory territory for nearly a century, and Keir Starmer must now believe that he is on course for an outright majority in the general election. As for the Tories' total despair, one former cabinet minister telling me this morning, these are the dying days of a corrosive party. Mid-Beds has been Conservative for nearly a century. Tamworth, your swing was bigger than the Blair swing in 1996, 23.9%. Can you believe it? I mean, it must be exceeding your own expectations.
We do accept victories like this humbly because we know that trust and confidence is precious and we have to earn that trust and confidence.
You were described as the heir to Blair. Number one, do you think you're now better than Blair in terms of the performances?
Well, look, Tony Blair won 3 times, produced a landslide victory for the Labour Party and allowed a Labour government to do incredible things for our country. We face different times and we go forward to a different challenge in 2024. But what I do want to do is follow in the footsteps of a leader of our party who took us from opposition into power.
Winning in true blue Tory shires, a crucial step on his way. Mid-Beds a seismic victory, but voters here saw it coming.
This year I knew that I wasn't going to vote Conservative after having Nadine Dorries here for all that time.
I think people were sending a message to the Conservatives. I don't think they were happy with everything that's gone on, the personalities perhaps.
When you look back on what the Tories have and haven't done, then I don't know who would really vote for them, really.
The PM on a diplomatic mission in Egypt, quick to blame local issues rather than his own leadership.
Obviously disappointing results. It's important to remember the context. Midterm by-elections are always difficult for incumbent governments, and of course there are also local factors at play here. I'm committed to delivering on the priorities of the British people.
But it's this man who the British people seem to be turning to, Starmer enjoying a hero's welcome in Tamworth too. He certainly will. 2 victories putting Labour firmly on the path to power. His smile says it all. Beth Rigby, Sky News in Mid-Bedfordshire.
Well, we saw the Prime Minister there, and it's certainly been a week of shuttle diplomacy to this region. The US Secretary of State, then the President and the UK's Prime Minister have all passed through. Let's bring in our International Affairs Editor, Dominic Waghorn. And Dominic, some success with the release of 2 hostages this evening, but trucks full of aid are still stuck on the wrong side of the border at Rafah.
Yeah, a furious week of shuttle diplomacy. We've had presidents, secretaries of state, prime ministers, foreign secretaries, crown princes, emirs, all trying to get stuck in diplomatically. But frankly, all we have to show for it at the end of that is, as you say, 20 trucks stuck at the border with Gaza, unable to get in to bring desperately needed aid to the people of Gaza, and 2 American hostages released. But listening and to the Secretary of State, but also to the Hamas statement about the release of those hostages, that seems to be more about a kind of war of words, a PR vendetta between Hamas and the US than any great diplomatic feat. So where are we now? Well, we have at least 4,000 dead in Gaza, 12,500 injured. Even if the Hamas-controlled Department of Health in Gaza is exaggerating those figures, it's still a massive loss of civilian life after 2 weeks of Israeli airstrikes. And the Israelis seem to be doing to the north of Gaza what the Russians did to Mariupol, pulverizing it even before the ground invasion began. And while that's going on in Gaza, great fears of regional instability, massive protests widespread across the region, not as big as recent days, but I think a lot of that's to do with the fact that jittery governments have put a huge amount of security forces out to try and quell the unrest. And I think there's a real fear of regional instability. At the same time, Iranian proxies firing cruise missiles from Yemen and artillery from Lebanon. So I think it's fair to say that diplomacy is currently failing, and the outlook for the region is, frankly, very worrying.
Dominic, live there for us in Amman in Jordan. Thank you very much indeed. Well, tomorrow in our special programme, we'll show you inside one of the kibbutz attacked to devastating effect 2 weeks ago. That's where it all began, of course. That is at 1 p.m. tomorrow, live from Israel. Now let's head back to Gillian.
Anna, thank you. Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's newspapers in the press preview. Tonight, we're joined by the Daily Mirror columnist Susie Boniface and the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, Jake Wallace-Simons. Amongst the stories we'll be discussing, the Israel-Hamas war, of course, and this story on the front of the Times. Their headline, Hamas frees kidnapped mother and daughter. We'll be right back. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. But first, our top stories. The first hostages to be freed by Hamas are a mother and daughter, both American citizens, but up to 200 others are still being held. In Gaza, Sky News has witnessed more civilians being killed where they thought they'd be safe as a church is hit by an Israeli airstrike. And Storm Babet claims 3 lives as rivers burst their banks and another red warning is issued in Scotland. You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the Daily Mirror columnist Susie Boniface and the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, Jake Wallace-Simons. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, the Times pictures mother and daughter, Judith and Natalie Raanan, who were freed tonight by their Hamas captors. The Raanans are also on the front of the Eye. Suggesting an invasion of Gaza could be imminent, the Mirror has the headline, Deadly Weight. The Mail meets a young woman conscripted into the Israeli army from her job in an ad agency who's about to start fighting for her country. The Financial Times reports that Israel intends to sever ties to the Gaza Strip once the current conflict is over. The Telegraph reveals that a planned terror attack in the UK, allegedly by an asylum seeker and linked to Gaza, has been foiled by the authorities. The Express hears that Conservative insiders reacting to last night's double by-election loss believe the best way to win back the electorate is to demonstrate so-called true blue values. While The Guardian quotes a victorious Sir Keir Starmer, that Labour is redrawing the political map. And The Star offers pearls of wisdom from an AI chatbot that apparently believes all humans are aliens living on a planet run by Elon Musk. A reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Susie Boniface and Jake Wallace-Simons. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with the Times and that breaking news this evening, the release of those 2 hostages, mother and daughter, released, we read, as an act of goodwill by Hamas. Front page of the Times. Susie.
Yeah, Joe Biden's going to be very happy that his visit to the Middle East seems to have produced some kind of results and that the first hostages are being released. Now, there's an estimated 200 people being held by Hamas. This is only 2. But it seems like these are US citizens, not Israeli citizens. They were there visiting family. They seem to have got caught up in the attacks. And it does look like as well the mother, Judith, had some health concerns and that she was being released, therefore, on humanitarian grounds with her daughter. But as we were saying before we came on, it raises lots of issues about, the humanitarian concerns of those hostages who are 18, 90-year-old grandmothers, who are young children without their parents, perhaps, who are perhaps all deeply traumatised, who are perhaps even Israeli soldiers who are wounded. On what grounds do we say that, they should also not be released and taken back to their families? And so there are other efforts going on, other nations speaking to the Hamas leadership, which is based in Qatar, to try to get as many people out as possible before this suggested ground invasion, which, we'll get onto it, but may or may not happen in the way that's expected.
But, Jake, positive news provides some hope.
Yes, definitely. I mean, obviously, any hostages coming out is definitely good news. These 2 are American citizens. There's no suggestion they're dual nationals, Israeli, American, just Americans. The deal was brokered by Qatar, which is also working on around 7 British hostages to try and help free them as well. So perhaps there's a small glimmer of hope that maybe we might expect or hope for some British hostages to come out as well. I don't think the same hope could be held at the moment for any of the Israeli hostages, that's for sure. But it's interesting, there's some details here, including that initially Hamas wanted to release them in exchange for a ceasefire, but those demands were rejected. And in the end, they were released with nothing given in return. That's a significant point, I think. But overall, you know, it's just devastating for all of those hostages. But, you know, this is a small glimmer of hope in an otherwise very dark time.
Yes, and Biden thanking the government of Qatar for their role of mediation, which we read that they continue to carry out. So let's hope that yields more releases. Let's have a look at the Mirror. Their headline, a deadly weight, and this is as to whether the tanks are ready to roll in on the ground. Some suggestion the release of the hostages might be a token to stop this actually happening.
Well, obviously, Hamas, if they're giving over hostages in return for apparently nothing, want some goodwill. And they want that goodwill from the international community. Now, the international story around this that's being woven at the moment is purely, mainly about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. The hostages have been a second item on the agenda, if you like. And so the fact that they're being used or they're being released or they're being, you know, exchanged in return for some kind of attention or gratitude or thanks or anything else that may be coming out of it indicates that, yes, there's people on both sides who would like to firstly move them out of harm's way, but also perhaps to use them as what they are, as tools to try to buy some kind of influence. But I don't really buy. I mean, I'm just not certain about this idea of a ground invasion. The Israeli government said within 24 hours that they wanted to go in and to do that in Gaza. It's been 2 weeks and it still hasn't happened. They've mobilised lots of reservists. They're in a situation where, having said it, it will be very difficult not to do it. But at the same time, if they go rolling into Gaza, then the chances are that Hezbollah in the north will open up a new front from Lebanon, and maybe even that Syria would try and retake the Golan Heights. You could end up, if you started a very messy urban bit of warfare, that you would have multiple fronts opening up, and Israel would then be fighting for its very survival on all sides. And I think that with the changes in the government we've seen since this happened, Netanyahu has brought in Benny Gantz, the opposition leader. There are now more moderate voices within the Israeli cabinet who weren't there before. I'm not entirely sure that it's going to proceed in the way that it was predicted on day one. I don't think that's going to happen.
I mean, as you allude to there, it does seem that there is a reluctance to go in on the ground. Just moving to the FT, and that's talking about the three-stage plan of the war, and that the third phase is to cut ties with Gaza completely, we read.
Yes, I mean, I think that the hostage release is interesting on another count, which is that Hamas, this is, in a way, a PR disaster for Hamas in many of the eyes of the Arab world, because it was so brutal, and it was what they did to those Israeli civilians was so horrendous, and it wasn't done with the knowledge of any of the Arab world, which they're now calling upon to become their allies and support them. And there's a lot of discontent there, as we've seen in various interviews conducted on Arabic TV recently. And so you could read the release of these two hostages as some kind of attempt to reclaim some kind of legitimacy on the part of Hamas. But from the Israeli point of view, they have no option. Hamas has got to go. They cannot live with this terror threat on their border, having seen what it can do to them and what they will do to their civilians. Even more relish, if that's possible, in the killing of Jews than the Nazis showed all those years ago. Israel cannot allow that to continue. I think there is going to be a ground invasion, as the Defence Minister pointed out in the story here in the FT. The first phase is going to be destroying Hamas via an air assault and a ground invasion. Then there's going to be the elimination of pockets of resistance in Gaza. And the third step is the most fascinating, I think, which is to cut ties with Gaza, which just goes to show that the idea that Gaza's been an open-air prison for all this time hasn't been entirely correct, because there have been 18,000 Gazans coming into Israel to work. There's been electricity, fuel, water and so forth going from Israel into Gaza. But the idea that Israel is going to cut off those ties implies heavily that Israel isn't intending to reoccupy Gaza. Don't forget, Israel withdrew in 2005 entirely. And so that, I think, in my mind anyway, has got to be good news, although what comes instead, nobody knows.
Well, that is the question, because they wouldn't be able to cross over to work in Israel. There'd be no movement at all. They wouldn't supply electricity. I mean, this is a complete severing of all
Israeli public opinion tends to be that there should be an occupation of Gaza. I don't think it would be practical. It would be logistically really possible. But there's a groundswell of opinion that should happen, especially in the wake of these attacks. But if they cut off ties subsequent to any conflict, the chances of it then becoming a hotbed again of terrorism, I would think, is fairly high. And it's not going to remove Hamas in the way that is required. And so I can't see how some of the rhetoric is going to marry up. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, the Israeli government before this was frail, and it was hardline, and it produced an awful lot of public protests in Israel from Israeli voters who really didn't like the coalition that had been cobbled together by Netanyahu. And I think with the discontent over the security failings, which meant they didn't see this attack coming, and now perhaps it not really doing even what the hardliners want, not going in straight away, leaving it 2 weeks, perhaps cavilling a little bit about some of the things, but how they're going to handle it, maybe that government could fall very quickly.
OK. Just to mention, we didn't get to the Guardian, but just on the humanitarian lifeline into Gaza still remaining closed, despite that, well, reportedly being opened up, but that still hasn't happened. We're going to take a break. Thanks very much for the moment. Coming up, should the lesson the Tories take from their double by-election defeat be that voters want them to go further to the right? We'll discuss that and more next.
Well, what I concentrated on in this film is the experiences of people trying to live a normal life in a situation where there was intense sectarian violence, and when you go out the door in the morning, you never know whether you come back alive or not. And I had a lot of questions about how do people live in a situation like this? What do they do to try to live a normal life? What do they tell their children? How do they renew a fragile sense of hope every morning to get themselves out of bed and out the door to do what they need to do? I decided it had to be a collective story because that situation is lived in a collective way. You're always aware of other people's lives as a context to your own life. So yes, it is. It's an ensemble film of intersecting stories that play out over the last week of 2006, which was at the height of the sectarian violence. And so you keep moving from one story to the other. And in the end, it is a collective story. There's a way in which fiction can somehow get further underneath, deeper into the characters than documentary does. And especially the kind of documentaries I make are always about people, but they are observational, so you're standing outside of it. And I think with fiction, you can actually delve a bit deeper into the characters, and so I had a go. People who are living through a war or in war zones are often depicted as just victims, and it's a kind of abstraction, which means that people can't really relate to them because they're living in a situation which is not a war. And so I was very keen to bring the stories there, the sort of daily struggles and so forth. But also, there is a sense of resistance that people have. That, for example, they tell jokes, they fall in love, they have babies. All of this, to me, is a resistance to this destruction that's going on around them.
Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, Susie Boniface and Jake Wallace-Simons. Let's take a look at some domestic news now. The by-elections. A buoyant Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, is over the moon. More than happy at the results of the by-election, perhaps beyond his wildest dreams, to win them both. Susie.
Well, sort of any political geek, really. So it's one thing that the Conservatives have said, look, it's a by-election, coming to the end of to an electoral cycle. This is the kind of thing that you expect. And yes, you do. But in by-elections, when the ruling party loses, it generally goes to the vote of a protest party. So you go to the Lib Dems, whether it's a Labour or a Tory seat, often goes Lib Dem. It's gone UKIP in the past, or Reform. It's gone, to a party that's sort of just adjacent to the ruling party, perhaps. But what's happened here is it's gone to the directly opposing party, to the opposition, which doesn't happen very often at all. And the last time, I was looking up today in the list of by-elections, the last time the Tories lost to Labour with a swing this big was 1994, I think it was West Dudley by-election. And that's the only time it had happened since the end of the Second World War. So this swing is slightly smaller than that, but it is historically shocking for a government to lose to the opposition. It would be like Blair losing to the Tories as opposed to the Lib Dems. It is very, very bad. And it's getting to the point now, I think, where, Rishi Sunak, he's had a big reset. He's had party conference. He's decided he's going to do some things that are unconservative, like banning smoking, while at the same time very conservative, like scrapping HS2. He can't cut taxes, he can't raise taxes, and he's going into this last year before the election with literally nothing else left to do. And I tend to be of the opinion that what the Conservative Party is going to do probably is just sort of sow the ground with salt on their way out the door, because they literally just want to, especially the way they ended HS2, not just to end it, but actually destroy it ever being reanimated again, is kind of more about now not saving themselves, but making it impossible or making it harder for Labour to rule.
Let's just get to Jaking, because we're running out of time. But do you see this result as a definite shoo-in for Labour, that Sir Keir Starmer will get behind that door at number 10?
Look, it's looking likely. If this result was projected nationally, it would be a massive landslide. It would be a Blair moment. These are historic results. Tamworth was the second biggest Tories-Labour shift since 1945. And the other one in Mid-Bedfordshire was the biggest margin in any record to be hauled back in any recorded UK election, according to The Guardian. Sunak, he's looking desperately for some tax cuts. The tax burden is the highest that we've had since the Second World War, and people are feeling it. Combined with the cost of living crisis, it's hurting people in their pockets. But the solutions he's looking for are either cutting stamp duty, cutting inheritance tax, both of which benefit middle-class, middle-aged, well-off, or perhaps bringing down the tax for high earners, which, again, that small number of people is benefiting.
We must leave it there. Much more time in the 11 o'clock hour. Thank you very much for the moment. Let's take a look at the weather for you now.